Welcome to Results Training Core Module 7, Ministry Approver Processing. Today we're going to go through an outline of the approver responsibilities and go through 4 of the types of documents that come through results that will require someone with approver authority to process those documents, and they include silviculture prescription amendments, Section 108 applications, opening amalgamations, and proposed stocking standards. First and foremost, there's going to be someone in the district that's going to be an assigned approver for results. Whoever that is assigned as having approver status is delegated that responsibility by the district manager. What happens is that there's 4 different kinds of items that will come through results that requires approval, which includes silviculture prescription, Section 108 relief application, amalgamation, and proposed stocking standards. What happens is that when we're dealing with the inbox, what happens is that depending on the type of document, there's different kind of documents you can filter off of to be able to highlight that particular documents that you want to review. When you're in an approver role, what happens is that you have to understand the full legal context of the document you are dealing with. So in the case of silviculture prescription amendments, what's happening here is that you're basically reviewing the context of a legal silviculture obligation. So you have the understanding of what the context of the document that's being provided, and if there's changes in the document, what are some of the implications before approving. In some situations, if we're dealing with, let's say, the Section 108 application, what happens with that, not only are you approving a document which deals with something like a relief of obligation, but in that document, sometimes there's also components about funding requests. So what will happen is that you need to be familiar with what are the program directives that deals with Section 108 applications, and find out what information that you need to know about whether or not what's applicable for under a Section 108 application, as well as if there's funding requests, whether or not there's adequate funding to meet that request before approval. So you need to be aware of what any policy directions are, and then that's basically talking to someone at in a regional office or at headquarters to find out more information about what you might need to know about Section 108 approvals as far as funding requests and eligibility. There's amalgamations that are also comes through results, and what they are is that they are a merging of multiple openings to be managed as one new opening. But what happens too is when we deal with amalgamations, there's some follow-up work that needs to be done as far as cleanup of submission of information to clean up the data components of an amalgamation after approval. So there's also that responsibility if there is an amalgamation that there needs to be some follow-up that has to be done. And when we're dealing with proposed stocking standards, what happens is that you need to make sure if there is stocking standards that come through results that they are actually applicable for coming through results and not something that is done through the forest stewardship planning tracking system, because we do have some stocking standards that are still coming through as a request for new ministry defaults or for something under a forest development plan. But for the most part, any new stocking standards that are coming in now comes through the forest stewardship plan tracking system. And so you have to make sure that when you're looking at these documents that the right location is being, the right mechanism is being used for providing the proposed stocking standards. So what happens is that when you've been assigned an approver role, what has to happen is that there is a component in results that allows the district to assign notifications. So in the results, what happens is that under the admin tab, there is option to select for district options, whereby for your district, you need to make sure you assign a user ID or email for the person that has the approver role. What happens is that whenever there is some documentation that comes through results, it is through this email that's been assigned that gets notification to tell you, inform you that there's a document that's been submitted into results that requires action. So if the ministry district office has had turnover, someone needs to make sure they go into this admin district option component to make sure that the email is updated to someone that is current, that is got that approver authority to make sure that they are notified of any pending changes that needs to be dealt with in the inbox. There's also an auto generate opening numbers, where what happens is that when spatial information comes in for a new opening, Results has the ability to auto number the map sheet opening number combination. Majority of districts have this checked as auto generating opening numbers. And what happens here is that the opening number is something that is auto assigned in sequence based on the map sheet and the spatial information that's supplied to Results. So just as a point that basically someone needs to be aware that this district option has to be current to whoever is assigned that approver role. So the first document we're going to talk about today is Silviculture Prescription Amendment. And what happens is that when we have a Silviculture Prescription Amendment, we're dealing with code openings. And what happens is that when there's an amendment, it goes through an inbox that has to then be processed before the actual changes takes place. So the licensee has two options. They can supply the amendment through ESF, or they could make those changes online. And when the amendment is submitted and it hits the inbox, what will happen is that from your perspective, through the inbox as the status, you select submitted, and what will happen is that any amendments will then appear in a listing. So at this point in time, when you go into the inbox, you have the ability to filter all submitted amendments. And then from here, you are able to review the content of the actual amendment, as well as it's in the inbox where the approvals will take place. So what happens is that when we select an opening that has a submitted amendment, you are then taken to the stocking standard screen that shows what is the current stocking standard that belongs to this opening, and there could be one or many standards unit. When you have a submitted amendment, there is this hyperlink for amendment proposed, which then allows you to click on to what is the context of the proposed amendment that they're requesting. It is important for you to make sure you go into the proposed amendment to the next screen to then be able to see what the full context of the changes are. So at this stage, when you select on the proposed amendment, you are then taken to a different screen, which is called this 312 Stocking Standard Amendment Request screen. And what happens here is that anything in red demarks any data element that's been changed under the context of the Silviculture Prescription Amendment. So what happens here is that between the previous screen, which is the S310 stocking standards, this is what the current standards unit is, and the proposed amendment, you are then able to compare the net changes of what is being requested. Always, usually at the bottom of the amendment screen, there will also be a rationale provided by the licensee, which provides context of the reasons why they're making these changes. The other thing you need to be aware of is that when you do go into the standards unit information, that we are dealing in some situations with multiple standards units that undergoes the proposed amendment, so you need to maybe toggle to multiple standards unit to review the various different standards unit, as well as looking at the scope of all the different components of the proposed amendments. In this one example, we only have one standards unit, but it is possible to have more than one standards unit, so you have to toggle and flip them back and forth to see the full scope of all the different proposed changes if it is pertaining to multiple standards units. Again, you need to make sure you also review the amendment rationale that provides a context of why the licensee is making these changes. So at this stage, at this screen, we're just really seeing the context of what is being changed. And when you select back a few times, what will happen is that you are then taken back to this inbox screen where there is the ability for you to decide to approve or not approve the silviculture prescription amendment. If you select approve, then what will happen is that this opening will then, all the changes that was in that proposed amendment will be incorporated as a part of the new standards unit information, and then the opening will disappear from the inbox and the opening will revert back to approved status. If you decide to not approve this silviculture prescription amendment, what will happen is that this amendment is no longer be in submitted status. It switches to be amended status, where then the licensee has to go back to either results to delete the amendment and then start again, or make the necessary changes to this proposed amendment and resubmit again so that it can be reviewed in the inbox for approval. So at this stage, if we don't do anything and it's still in submitted status, there's actually physically no changes to the standards unit. So anything that's in that 312 screen is still in a sort of a pending mode. So nothing's been changed yet. And the other thing too is when we have any openings that are in a submitted status for an amendment, what happens is that this standards unit or the opening will not allow for any declarations to happen with the milestone screen. And that's mainly because there is potentially changes that are being reviewed for the standards unit, so it will disallow ability for you to go or anybody to go in and make changes to the milestone until the opening is processed. So in the inbox, what happens is that when you do select approve, there will be a dialog box to make sure that you confirm that you are okay to proceed with approval of the amendment. So that's a step that must be completed. If there is, once the approval happens, then the opening will change from submitted to approved status, and all that information that was in that 312 proposed amendment screen now will get carried over into the actual 310 stocking standard screen. So now all the changes that were requested as the proposed amendment becomes now applied to the standards unit. So it's now real. If there is a not approval, what will happen is that there is a dialog box that comes up and you must complete and provide detailed information about why you're not approving the silviculture prescription amendment. So providing that justification is a mandatory requirement from a screen perspective. And then what happens is that when you hit save, then the not approval is complete. The information you provide in this dialog box will then be sent back to the licensee in the form of an email so that they actually know that the document, the amendment document was processed. If it's not approved, this is the reason why. So it's important for you to provide meaningful information to provide justification why the document was not approved. And when it's not approved, what happens is that the opening changes from submitted status to amended status. And at this stage, it's up to the submitter to go into results to delete the amendment and submit a new one, or they can work with the existing amendment and make whatever modifications they need online and then resubmit that online. So there's several options, but the idea is that the submitter must then do something with this amendment because it's now in this kind of amended status. So something needs to be done if they wish to supply a new amendment or delete the amendment and start again with a new amendment document. So the other thing too is once the amendment has been processed, what happens to results is that it does track information about the changes that was made to the standards unit through two mechanisms. There is SU history that is embedded within the stocking standards screen, as well as a history button that is a part of the main tombstone information for results. So there's two ways of which this information is audited. And what happens is that when we select the SU History component, you are taken to this screen called Stocking Standards History, which gives you a chronology of all the major events that have happened for the standards unit. And when you select on the detail component, it provides you with a snapshot of the information showing you what is the standards unit before and after the change. And what happens is that it takes a snapshot of what the pre-existing standards unit looked like. Any component of the change action that had occurred to the actual standards unit will appear in red and italicized. So anything that's in black stayed remain as is, but anything in red shows the net changes of what was the scope of, in this case, an amendment. Other actions are audited as well. So all like corrections, minor amendments, silviculture prescription amendments, approved variations, and site plan amendments, all those are actually audited through this mechanism. The only thing that you need to also know about this display of information is that this functionality of providing this snapshot comparison of before and after only came into effect since March 2008. So what happens is that if there had been any changes to the standards unit document prior to 2008, that information is not shown in this format. This infrastructure was built starting as of that point in time. So the tracking of any other changes of that has to be done through the history component. And to get to that is that in the tombstone for the opening, you select history, and you are taken to the event tracking history button, which then tracks all the events that have taken place for the entire opening. And when you click on any of the event, detailed information will appear that shows you the change data elements under the scope of that particular action. So this auditing of information for standards units is different, where only the net changes of the data elements that had been the scope of the amendment is shown, whereas the other screen that shows the SU history gives you a comprehensive display of the whole standards unit and illustrating just the changed data elements, so you can see the standards unit in full, whereas this screen shows you only the specific changes that were made for the standards unit. Two different ways of auditing the information. The history will show all the changes and major events that has occurred in results since results' inception. So that's the major difference here, is that for history, it goes back since the inception of results. So it does have the historical context of all the changes that have occurred. But it will only show you the data elements that had undergone the changes rather than giving you a whole snapshot of history. So just to show how amendments work, we're going to now go into an actual record. And in this case, we're just going to go through an example in tests to pick on any licensee. This is test data, just to illustrate the functionality of results and how this will appear and how the system processes. So in this case, we have an opening where we have a standards unit that has had already a submitted amendment supplied. And so what it is that if you go into the stocking standard screen, this shows you what the standards unit looks like. And in this case, if you go into the amendment proposed, this would take you to the detailed information about what the scope of the changes of the actual standards unit. Again, don't fret about the actual changes that I've made in this data example. Obviously, if you are going to be in the position of reviewing the amendment, then you would have to put your forestry hats on in terms of understanding the scope of the business of the information that's been supplied and what is the net effect of what the changes being proposed are, as whether or not it makes sense or not. So what happens here is that if you're in the approver role, you would have been granted the ability to go into the inbox, I have to change my district reference because I have provincial access, but most of you will be assigned a specific district that you belong to. And what happens is that when you're in an approver role, you go into this inbox, and if you're processing a silviculture prescription amendments, you're looking for submitted documents. So what happens is that you select submitted and search, and then what happens is that two kinds of documents would come up. You have amendments and also proposed stocking standards. So we're going to talk about amendments first. So what happens is that these are all amendment documents that have been now submitted to me in the inbox. And what happens here is that you have to then decide and go through which ones you want to go through. You probably want to go through sequentially. Again, some of these documents have been supplied a long time ago because this is our test environment, so we use this just as a way of testing our data. But what I want to do is just go through the example that I showed you. In this inbox, as you can see, you can go into the details, which takes you to the specific opening details, but it's here is where the approval and not approvals has to take place. So when I select details, I'm now taken to the actual stocking standards component for the standards unit that has the amendment. So this 310 is what the current standards unit has. Again, if we have more than one standards unit, you need to toggle through and look at the different standards unit. And then we select the amendment proposed. This is the scope of the actual amendment that is being made. And in this case, you can toggle through to look at the other standards units as well. Anything in red indicates that's going to be a change data element. So you have to do a little bit of back and forth between this screen as well as the stocking standards screen to compare before and what's being proposed to make sense of what is being requested and does it make sense. And then what happens is that in this example, it's just a test data, but the licensees will often provide you with a lot of details about the amendment rationale, why they're making the changes, and so you can also review that in detail. At this stage, all this information that appears in the amendment request screen is all grayed out because the information is submitted to you by the licensee and it's locked down. You can't make any actual changes to the actual submitted document. So what happens is that once you've gone through the document and reviewed all the standards unit and compared that against the stocking standard, then what happens is we keep hitting the back button. We're taken back to the inbox, whereby then you have to decide whether you're going to approve or not approve the document. As said earlier, what happens is if I select not approve, I will be forced to enter the reasons why I'm not approving, and you type in your reasons why, and once I hit save, then this will automatically be sent back to the licensee, and this opening will no longer appear in the inbox as submitted. It will default back to amended status, and then the licensee has to decide what to do with it, whether they delete the amendment from results and start again and submit again ESF wise, or make the changes online and resubmit again for the amendment document. In this case, I'm just going to go and approve this. And again, you get this last chance dialog box. And once I hit yes, what happens is that this opening will no longer appear. So my opening drops off this list. And then what happens is that when I go back to my opening, this opening now switches back to approved status. So now it's active, so that the milestones are no longer locked down, so that if the licensee wants to do anything in terms of submissions for milestones and stuff, now they can do that. When there is a pending amendment, the milestones are locked down, so there's no ability to make any updates, just because there's potential changes to the standards, the stocking standards unit information. But the information for activities in force cover can still be submitted. So in this one example, the scope of the changes that were in those red screens would be now reflected in the standards unit. So now that information has been moved forward to being the current standards unit information. And in this case, there's two of them because we added a standards unit. If you can remember before, this one opening only had one standards unit, but I added a new standards unit as a part of the amendment. As well, now, when I go into the SU history, what happens is the scope of the changes that was made is also tracked here in this SU history. So when I go into the details, you have the information about when the amendment was submitted and when it was approved, as well as having the full details of what was the actual before and after changes for this record. So red means it's new and black means it was pre-existing. So this is just to show you how the information audits this information should there be a need to go back in time to review what's been done to the opening as far as standards unit changes. The other area that we audit information is in the tombstone via the history information. All the events that happen here are actually documented, and then what you are able to do is go into the amended. You can go into, sometimes there's duplications here, but you can go into the amended to find out what the specific data elements are that are being actually changed. So this is another way of how the system audits information. So that is it for amendment, and so we're going to go back to my PowerPoint and switch my display. So the key here is that when we have silviculture prescription, when we have this amendment submitted to us, if we approve it, then what happens is that it basically switches to approved status. Everything is back to normal for the opening. But if there's not approved for the silviculture prescription amendment, then the licensee has to do something with the actual opening to either go in and delete the opening and start again, or they can go in and make changes to amendment and then resubmit it. When we have ESF, what happens is that it comes through as an ESF silviculture prescription amendment. It doesn't go through this amended status, it just goes directly to submitted status. But the same thing applies. If it's approved, it's back to normal again for doing any updates. But if you have a not approved, then something has to be done from the licensee's perspective to go in and delete the amendment or make changes to the amendment and submit again. So that's it. So the next section for inbox processing is the Section 108 application. And there's a lot of pieces to Section 108 application. There's legislation components. There's also the understanding of the requirements and what goes into building a Section 108 application, even though in your case you're basically an approver, but you need to make sure the document is complete and the system does some rudimentary checks to make sure certain pieces are provided. And then basically you have to understand how, where some of the documentations are if you need to deal with dealing with Section 108 applications, and understanding a little bit more about how things should be processed as far as business processes. So as far as the legislation is concerned, in FRPA, there's a Section 108 where the government may fund extra expense to deal with a catastrophic damage or waive the obligation. And so there's actual significant sort of reasons from which Section 108 can be used. And so basically there has to be some rules that comes into play as far as the type of catastrophic damage that's applicable, and as well as there's conditions about the fact that these catastrophic the catastrophic damages was not caused by the company or some actual person, or caused due to negligence of due diligence to some degree, right? So there's all these kind of rules that comes into play when we deal with Section 108, and there's actual declarations of certain things in the form to say that, this is something that is an act of God kind of thing. So you have to, make sure you review the document to make sure you understand the legislation, as well as making sure that the elections have been made in the actual Section 108 application. And then in the legislation, what happens is that if all those conditions are met as far as catastrophic damage and the fact that it was an act of God and not caused by any, negligent acts, then what happens is that the government has to relieve obligation and grant funding to restore the stands up to the point in which the catastrophic damage had occurred, before the catastrophic damage had occurred. So I think that's really critical. And so when we deal with the Section 108 application, we're really trying to allow ability to restore the stand up to that point in time when that catastrophic, just before that catastrophic condition had occurred. So in order to do that, there's a bunch of preconditions that has to happen in results to ensure that we have enough information about deciding to approve or not approve the Section 108 application. So one of the things that must be provided into results in order to complete the Section 108 application is that there must be a pre-event force cover that describes that pre-event catastrophic event condition, and this has to be supplied first because that informs the government this is all the investment and time that has been made to the stand up to the point where that event had occurred. So it tells us this is the amount of stand development that has taken place, and stand investment, stand development that has taken place. And then also another force cover has to be supplied to represent the post-event force cover, and this is to show this is the level of damage that has occurred now. And when this force cover is supplied, it's for the entire opening, being mindful that what happens is that the post-event force cover, you're still supplying the information for the entire opening, but not entirely the whole opening might have undergone that catastrophic damage, only a subset of that. But you still have to supply the information for the entire force cover, but now you're showing what components of the opening got burned up or had some sort of disease, infestation, whatever. But you have to provide a pre and post for the entire opening. And then also there has to be providing the disturbance activity that represents the catastrophic damage. So these all three things are preconditions in order to complete the Section 108 application. And so what happens is that, the submissions will have to come in, make sure that pre-catastrophic event is there, up to date, and it has to be in the right order. And then a submission comes in afterwards that tells us here is the catastrophic damage in terms of the level of damage that was done. And so it's important, if you're trying to sort of do this all at once, that the force cover for the pre-catastrophic event must be supplied first, and then you have to wait a day and then supply the post-catastrophic event afterwards. And so and have to wait a day just because of the way results process information for force cover. But this is what the licensee has to go through with the building of the Section 108 application. And they also have to supply the actual catastrophic damage as far as the damage report. And so what happens is that once all this information comes in, then what happens is that you have to use this information to review the Section 108 application. So it's really important when the licensees are submitting their information, they're not making changes to initial disturbance that has occurred for this opening. So it would have been a harvested opening that had a legal obligation. They're not supposed to touch that initial disturbance. It stays as is. They're providing a new disturbance activity. And what happens, that new disturbance activity is what is used to build that Section 108 application. And this new disturbance activity will not change the regeneration and free-growing milestone due dates. So if there's a requirement to also make adjustments to that because they're asking a request for funding, but then they're not going to be able to meet those milestone dates, then amendment must come in to adjust for regen and free-growing dates accordingly. So what happens is that you have the ability of supplying a stocking standard changes through a silviculture prescription amendment if it's a silviculture prescription amendment, or doing a site plan amendment. So these are sort of just high-level overview information that has to go through when the licensee is making a decision about how they're going to achieve the new, how to achieve the requirements based on this catastrophic damage that had occurred if they're requesting for funding. So the critical piece here is that when you're in an approver role, when the Section 108 applications come in, you'll find that there's going to be maybe an amendment that comes in also with the document. So it's really important for you to make sure you look at the amendments and review the amendments prior to the Section 108 creation, and if at all possible. And so what happens is that when you're actually looking at the Section 108 application, if there is an amendment that's there, what happens is that in the case of when you're doing a Section 108 approval, it also approves a silviculture prescription at the same time. So it's really important to be aware if there is an amendment, you may have to look at that in a lot of detail before you look at the Section 108 application, or you look at them together, but you have to make sure that everything is in sync and the amendment looks okay before you approve the Section 108 application. So that's a really critical piece if you're in the approver roles. And as the approver, your roles are to make sure all the prerequisite information supplied in the Section 108 application is correct. They have the pre-post force cover and the disturbance report, and it makes sense with all the authorization boxes are checked. There's two options. There's a relief of obligation or a request for funding. So what happens is that if there's a request for funding, it's really important before doing any approvals to ensure that there's sufficient funds to available for Section 108, because what happens is that headquarters uses this Section 108 application as a way of tracking and cutting the check. And so what happens is that it's important to make sure that the money is there before any approvals happen. And there's also guidance on if there's requests for funding, there's guidelines on terms of what unit costs are within an acceptable realm. So there's a lot of things to think about when we're dealing with requests for funding, and that's something that needs to be discussed ahead of time or reviewed ahead of time in conjunction with what the directives are by the program folks that manages Section 108. If the document contains a silviculture prescription amendment, you also have to review that also to make sure it makes sense. And then what happens is that when the approver approves or not approves the application, it's really important to make sure you understand the context of the document. It's possible to reject the application so they can make changes to or provide a new update for the Section 108 application if they need to. You can make adjustments if necessary, so that's a possibility. So it's really important to make sure that before the approval happens, that all the documentation makes sense and it's correct. If you do not approve the application, what happens is that the application still remains in the system as draft. So there's ability for the submitter to work on the application again. So what's really important is that when we're dealing with Section 108 application, there's a whole set of pieces of information that has to be provided. And the idea here is that the system will look after some of these pieces as far as mandatory edit checks, but you still have to be familiar with more of the context and business component. So again, if they're providing a planning regime, your job is to make sure that there's adequate funding, the costs are within line with what's been recommended. And if there's things like silviculture prescription amendments provided, then you have to also make sure you review those. In some cases, there might be attachments provided. So there's a lot of pieces that are there. And so the next few slides just goes through how this information looks online, but really when the licensees put in the application, they have to provide all those pieces of information like the catastrophic event that's taken place for the disturbance. The pre and post force cover allows you to be able to view the force cover condition, so you know the extent of what was before and after that is subject for funding if they're requesting for funding. And when you're looking at the application as an approver, all this stuff is not updatable. It's basically only view only. And if there is a request for funding, what happens is that there will be a list of here the proposed treatment regime that they're asking for. We ask that if it is a Section 108 that the licensee uses FRP as the actual funding source code, so to ensure that we have some consistency with how these appear in the system. And then again, the cost information comes through the licensee as what they enter in. And so you have to confer back to the program to ensure that the information are within an acceptable average unit cost that is deemed acceptable. And if there is any amendments, you'll see that there will be some indication of that through this other section of the form. And it's important for you to review this and make sure that you are in agreement with the content of the amendment prior to approving the Section 108, because what will happen is that it's possible to have amendments that are not necessarily in sync with what is required. So, but what happens is that if you need to do something else with the amendment, like you're not in agreement with it, you can go outside and not approve the amendment outside of the actual Section 108 application process that separately as an amendment. Because what happens if you are to process and approve the Section 108 application, it approves both documents at the same time. So if you have a problem with the amendment, you need to deal with that independently of the Section 108 application, and ideally before the approval of the actual application. And if there's some cases, if they want to provide attachments, then you have the ability to look at the document as well that they provide if they are providing attachments. There's some standards about what the recommendation is as far as how to provide attachments and maximum size limits. And then at the very bottom of the form, there's a lot of eligibility boxes that they have to check off. And this is more or less in a line of what is the requirements based on the legislation. And then what happens is that they submit the application and then it goes into the inbox. So from your perspective as a reviewer, what happens then is that you will go into the inbox as status relief, and any Section 108 will appear, and then you go into the details to then review the Section 108 document, and in the actual Section 108 document is where the approvals takes place or not approvals take place. So at the very bottom of the screen, you'll find that that's where the actual approval, not approval happens. And if there is a reason for not approval, then you can write something down. The information that is provided in the not approval gets stored and tracked for this application, as well as being sent as an email to the licensee who submitted the Section 108 application. So you can do the not approvals also through the inbox. So there's two ways for you to process this information, but approvals have to go through the Section 108 application. So again, really important, in the actual Section 108 application, you find that there is the showing about whether or not there's a silviculture prescription amendment that's been supplied in conjunction to the Section 108 application. It's important to look at this information. And again, when the Section 108 approvals happen, this particular document for a silviculture prescription amendment is also approved at the same time. So it's important that you know that amendments cannot be not approved and deleted from a Section 108 application once it's been submitted. So you basically have to sort of process these amendments ahead of time before the Section 108 approval. So it's really important to do that. So what I'm going to do is, once the Section 108 is approved, what happens is the Section 108 application will be available still to view, but all the information will be locked down. But you'll find that the approval of the application will now set this particular opening, the Section 108 application, as approved. So now the information is locked down and can't be modified. So again, I just keep on emphasizing this amendment gets processed at the same time as the Section 108 application. So what I'm going to do now is go into results again, and in the inbox I have going into a district, I have a few examples here. Again, it's test data. So what happens in the inbox, if you're looking for a relief of obligation, it's status of relief. Hit search. And here I've got a few of them. I'm just going to pick one. So what happens here is that when we go into the application, what happens is that for the details, you see that all the buttons are grayed out because it's locked down. It's a submitted application, so you can't modify anything. You have the ability to view the information that's provided as part of the application. The key here is that if you're a reviewer, you're going to look at the forest cover before and after to sort of understand the context of what the stand was like prior to the catastrophic damage, and then looking at the afterwards. Again, this is test data, but what happens is that when you go back and forth, you'll be looking at real data that the licensee provided, and the idea here is that you're doing a comparison of the before and after to understand the scope. And if it was a relief from obligation, it would be checked yes. But in this case, again, it's like our test data. But if usually what happens is that it's either relief of obligation or funding source, right? So in this one example, both was checked, but in reality, you have one or the other. You have the treatment regime that's available for the opening that they've proposed that is going to allow them to take the stand back to the pre-catastrophic damage in terms of investment. So your job is to look and review for the type of treatments required and the area and the cost to confer back to the extent of damage to see whether that's reasonable. The other thing too is there's going to be guidance on unit cost. So that's something else you have to review to make sure that what they're proposing is in line with what is the operational norm that's considered. And then what happens is that whatever the cost is that's in this form is what then is going to be considered, if you approve it, the check that's written to the licensee. So it's important to make sure that there's adequate funding for the treatments that are being proposed. And again, this is test data, so the numbers are kind of wonky. If there was standards units identified here as silviculture prescription amendments, what happens is that you can toggle to that. In this case, I do not, but if you did have that, you need to go and look at the standards unit silviculture prescription amendment. Make sure that you're in agreement with that in context of what's also being proposed as a part of the Section 108 application. If you have a problem with the silviculture prescription amendment, you need to get out of this inbox and process that amendment separately first, and then maybe wait for them to resupply a new amendment, and then perhaps delete or not approve the amendment and have them rebuild the application again from scratch with the new amendment. So there's some sort of back and forth that could happen if there is some problems with the amendments. And then if there's any attachments, review the attachments, and then all the eligibility boxes needs to be checked. And if there's a problem with the the amendment, you have to type in your reason. I've been using this record for other reasons, so I type this in. But what happens if you do not approve this amendment, then what happens is that this information ends up being back in draft status. So what happens is that I'm just going to approve this, but what happens is that when you approve it, this opening with the Section 108 becomes saved, and then this application gets locked down and used for reference for future. So when we go back now to this opening and we go into the application, you find that the application is here, and then all the information is locked down, but now it's in approved mode. It's possible to have more than one application for an opening. So that's just the functionality of how this works as far as the inbox. So if I was to go back and look up to DJA for relief, what happens is that we will no longer find this particular relief of application existing because it's now been processed. So that's in a nutshell for Section 108. There's a lot of little things about it. So we do have, again, you can follow the slide deck that will provide you with sort of a chronology of pieces of information that you need to know about. And there's also other documents that exist that provide information about how this all works. And so, yeah, once we have the application completed, you can go into the Section 108 application to look at the application. So this kind of goes through the chronology of all the pieces of information I talked about. Again, it's in as a slide deck so that people can review on their own if they need to. And the other piece of information I forgot to show you is that whatever treatment regime that ends up being in the Section 108 application, upon approval, what happens is that these activities get plunked into the opening activity summary and they appear as planned activities. It looks like it's completed here, but it's not. It's actually planned activities. And they just sit there showing that there's a bunch of relief of application activities that's there. I mean, licensees more than likely will submit their own completion activities on their own, but this information is also auto-generated from the treatment regime supplied through the Section 108. So that's something new that people, might not be aware of, is that when we go back to results for the opening that I just did the processing for, upon the approval of that Section 108 activity, and again, I've been hammering away at this with a variety of different testing records, but here are like the 3 treatment regimes that were part of that Section 108 that ended up being created, and they are planned activities, and the planned activities is auto-filled with the approval date as the planned date. So again, the licensee may use this to confirm activities once they're completed, or they can also just supply their activities, completed activities like normal. So that is the Section 108 application. So the thing here is that there is communications that are sent out on a regular basis about processing of the Section 108 application. So if you are involved with doing any of these, you need to just find out from the program leads what's the most recent, latest documentation and guidance, especially to deal with. This one talks about eligibility in terms of types of catastrophic damage, but it's important to also have the current directives as far as what the funding availability is. So yeah, just make sure you communicate with the program leads to find out about approvals and money. So the next one is amalgamations, and amalgamations is required to it's available if there's a requirement to merge multiple cut blocks that's being managed into one opening, and actually it's a requirement to merge multiple openings to be managed under one opening. So there's certain rules that have to be adhered to, like openings must belong to the same client, same org unit, so you can't have a mishmash of different ownerships of different openings and org units. And what happens though is that when we have amalgamations, what we're getting done in results is that it stacks all the standards units, activities and force cover for all the eligible openings that's been identified as a candidate for the amalgamation into one giant opening. So it's a real big mess. So what happens is that there's a lot of work that needs to be done to clean this information up, because the system will auto number standard units and the force cover. So there is really like a systematic magic is happening, but it's literally taking a whole bunch of file folders and just stacking them all together, and there's no real reorganization of that. So what happens is that it's really important, if there is an amalgamation that takes place, someone goes back and clean them up, especially the spatial line work, to make sure it makes sense. So, and there's no systems check for this post-amalgamation cleanup, so it has to be locally monitored. So when you amalgamate, the expectation licensee is going to go back and clean this stuff up. So what happens is that when we have amalgamations, they come through the inbox, and the way in which to filter those is through this amalgamate code. And what happens is that any amalgamates will appear and you can look at them, and what happens is that you'll see that there's going to be the list, which is the original openings that currently exist in results, and then you have a proposed opening for the amalgamate, the product, the byproduct of what the outcome of the amalgamation is. What's really, really important is that the amalgamation list is what is the current opening. So you can look these guys up. So 1158070 and 118756 are real openings. So what happens is that when you go into results, you can actually call those up if it's still not yet finished with the amalgamation process. And what happens is that someone has to designate one of these as the prime. So what will happen is whichever opening that becomes the prime opening, that becomes now the tenure that is associated with the opening. But the other opening that is also identified, even though it's non-prime, will appear as the tenure information in the multi-tenure tab. When you go in and it's not amalgamated yet, you will not be able to find this proposed new opening of 1554411. It doesn't exist yet until this amalgamation is completed. So we have had questions about, I'm looking for this 1554411. It doesn't exist. Until the amalgamation is completed and approved, this is just a holding ID for now. But what will happen is that it just shows you the information in full context, but you'll find that there's no information right now associated with this opening identifier before amalgamation, but it tells you what it will be. So it's really important for you to know that. So what happens is that when you hit approve, and it's simple as that, you find out what the candidate openings are, what the new opening is going to be. But what happens is that when you finish the actual approval, all the information as far as all the standards units, activities, force cover, and milestone all get kind of munched into the new opening ID. And the only reference you would have had that there was an amalgamation that occurred and what the pre-existing opening IDs and tenure information was is embedded in the history component of results through a comment field. So it becomes a bit of a nightmare if you have to do amalgamations because the tenure information is not lost, it's still here. But if you need to be able to reference back to the opening IDs in any way, shape, or form, all that information is kind of couched in a string text. So it becomes quite difficult to utilize. So I tell people amalgamation is an afterthought. Sometimes people need to do it, but if there's a need to do a multi-cut block opening, it's better to set that up at the very beginning at the opening creation stage. But then things happen, like catastrophic damages, etc., where sometimes there is a requirement to do amalgamation after these openings have been created. If there is that requirement to do that, there's still a considerable amount of time required to fix things up, to kind of clean things up, because all the spatial information and references to the standards unit and the force cover standards unit is not really in sync anymore. It's just really messed up because it's literally just mashing all that information into a new bin. So, going back to my example in my inbox, I have a couple of examples that I have in amalgamation. So again, we use the status amalgamate. And there's a few examples here. So when we go into amalgamate, again, you need to go into the details to see the full scope of the information that you have. And as you can see, in this case, we've got the two original opening IDs, 27902, 27903, and we have this new one called 1011603. As I had said before, I'm just going to go back here. If I go and look up this, it shows that this is an amalgamate opening, but you find that there's missing information associated with this opening. It's kind of an empty shell that's been created. There's no information yet because it's created as sort of like a opening ID as a holding pen for this potential amalgamation. So all the information is actually empty for this, and it really doesn't exist yet because it's kind of a part of amalgamation that's about to take place, but it hasn't happened yet. And so if I look at another example of the actual openings that are associated with this amalgamation, this is where all the information is. So it's a one cut block opening with two standards units with 12 activity records. And we've got 3 polygons. And then we go into the other opening that is a part of the child opening. We see that it too is a one cut block opening. And this one has also 2 standards units with 7 activities and 3 polygons. And so when we look at the milestones in both these cases, there's 2 SUs, right, with the various different milestones. So that just shows you this is what the original openings look like. So going back into the inbox, so right now nothing's been done. This is amalgamation that's in a holding pen. So if I don't approve, what would happen is that this opening ID will disappear, doesn't exist anymore, and these openings will flip back to approved status. So nothing's happened. But if I do approve this, I'll get this dialog box that comes up saying, are you sure it's going to give me this new opening? But then essentially these other openings, the original opening identifiers, will be deleted. So essentially the system will then take all this information and mishmash all this information together. So now if I go back to the opening and I look up those original openings, they don't exist anymore, right? So those opening IDs got deleted, and now if I look up that opening ID that was the proposed opening ID, you find that the information now is filled with the information that was stored in those pre-existing openings. So I had one cut block opening for each, so now I've got two. And so whichever one that was designated as prime now becomes the prime and is shown in the tombstone. Now for the stocking standards unit, I had two standards unit for each of them. Now it just takes them and mashes the 2 plus 2 is 4 standards unit, but it auto numbers them for me, whether it makes sense or not. All the activities now gets munched into one. So before I had one opening that had 12 activities, the other one had 7, so that's 19 in total. And then the force cover, you can see that all the force cover that existed there gets renumbered, and the information is intact, but the opening IDs that has been assigned is in sequential order that the system's assigned, and there's no reference to the standards units. If it had been provided, I don't actually really know what happens to them because the standards unit got renumbered, and then the milestones information just gets shoved into the system, and you'll see that the way in which the numbering is in sequential order. So what happens here is that the post amalgamation just shoves everything into one file folder, and it kind of does a number in terms of making a jumbled mess out of the stocking standard and the force cover and the milestone identifiers. So what happens is that it's really important to go back and try to clean this stuff up, because this all happened from an attribute basis, but the spatial information is pretty much not making any sense anymore, right? So new spatial needs to be provided to redraw the opening boundary, the standards unit boundary, and the force cover boundary, and that has to be supplied after the fact. There's a lot of cleanup efforts that needs to take place. The system does not do that for you. The only other things that you can figure out, if there was a need that there had been amalgamation, this is couched into the event component or history component of results. And what happens is that if you need to figure out which opening was a part of the candidate of the amalgamation, this information is stored in as a descriptive text. And that's the only place where all this stuff will be. So the amalgamation gets a bit of it gets to be quite challenging from a data management perspective in terms of tracking what the preconditions are for the opening IDs. If you track things by opening IDs, the tenure is still there, but then what happens is that there's a lot of things that needs to happen to clean things up for the map work, because the spatial information no longer is applicable post-amalgamation event. So it's something that happens that is in the system as a process that is allowed, but what happens is that there's a lot of work that has to be done by the licensee afterwards to clean things up. Okay, so my last part is to talk about the stocking standards, proposed stocking standards. So results has three kinds of stocking standards. We have stocking standards that ties to forest development plans. So we've got ministry defaults, and we've got also woodlot defaults as well. And there might be a requirement to propose new FDP or woodlot stocking standards. I mean, it would be very rare, but it's possible. And the key here is that not a lot of stocking standards are being processed through results anymore. I mean, it's really a lot of it's legacy related. So it's really important when you do see stocking standards that are coming in to make sure you're critical about what its purpose, because if it's a stocking standard relates to FSP, it has to come through the FSP tracking system, and it shouldn't be coming through results at all. So it's really important to be knowledgeable about what what should be coming through stocking standards through results. If it's a standards regime that needs approval, is it appropriate, and is this the right mechanism for that? So if you are involved and you do have to, on the odd chance, to go through stocking standards, in the inbox, what happens is that they would be submitted, and what happens is that the status is submitted, but what will happen is that in the type, they will show up as standards. And what happens here is that you would go into the details, and then you can see the context of what is being proposed as the stocking standards. The system will assign the standards ID, and it's basically a unique identifier for the stocking standards. If it's submitted, you can't use it. It's not available for use. So from the approver's perspective, has to review the context of the stocking standard to understand what is it for. Hopefully it's for a reason that makes sense for having it approved through results. And it's in this screen where basically you decide to approve or not approve the stocking standard. If you don't approve it, then basically it will default to it will be rejected. In the approval component, you also have the ability to specify the effective and expiry dates as well. So in order for the stocking standard to be effective, to be used, it has to have an effective date, but the expiry date can be null, or it could be set to a certain date. And what happens is the dates are being used as well as the status in order to be available for use. So stocking standards, there's rules where if you're going to be using these new stocking standards, has to be approved for use and it has an effective date that makes sense and it's not expired. So the proposed stocking standards, what happens is that from your perspective, you go through, you can also review what stocking standards are in the system through the standards admin search component to be able to look at the details of the various different stocking standards and what kinds of changes that has been made. I'm not going to go through this in a demonstration, but the idea is that the stocking standards approval is pretty straightforward. More importantly, from your perspective, is the use of the stocking standards coming through into results? If you're in approval role, is it valid for going through this mechanism, and does it make sense for whatever they're trying to propose it for? And if you need to locate or review any kind of stocking standards that have been reviewed, you have the ability of looking up the history information and find out information about any stocking standards that's been reviewed, or if it's been rejected, why it's been rejected. So you have the capability of looking up that information as well in results. So finally, approver responsibilities. Again, I talked about all of this stuff already, but you have to make sure that you have the understanding of legal context of what's being submitted. So in the case of silviculture prescription amendments, does it make sense? You have to also, the same would apply for stocking standards. Is it appropriate for having that stocking standards coming through to results versus going through the tracking system? And in the case of Section 108, we talked about when you're going through and reviewing the application, is it appropriate for going through the application? If it's a request for funding, is there adequate funding? And making sure that the funding makes sense. The funding request matches what is being needed to bring the stand back to the pre-catastrophic condition. And for amalgamation, things happen. And if they need to amalgamate, okay, that's fine, but be mindful that there's a lot of follow-up work that needs to take place to make sure that that opening is cleaned up post-amalgamation approval. So these are things that are sort of part of that umbrella of responsibilities to follow up and make sure that you know what needs to happen for a lot of these documents. So that's it for today. And so if you need more information on results, we do have our help resources available and questions and answers that you can look up. As well, this presentation as well as other recordings are posted on our training and resources website for results. So if you need to review this in more detail, you can actually go and look you've got the recording and you've got the PowerPoint presentations, and you can also find out more about some of these other modules. So that's it for today. So thank you very much for listening in.